Chapter 9 is called The Parents, and we see what happens after Miss Honey has tried to approach Miss Trunchbull about advancing Matilda into a higher form, and having no success, decides, well, I'm going to go to the parents to try and see what happens. In this chapter, we have Miss Honey, and we see her absolute dedication to furthering Matilda's education and also her own passion for education. And we have the Wormwoods, who basically once again are framed as morally inferior, and the role of the television and which compares to the interest in education and how that is also morally superior. The chapter opens with Miss Honey basically saying, I'm going to help Matilda, and the first thing that she does is that she collects a number of books on different subjects from the higher classes and gives them to Matilda in order for her to be able to work on these during the classes as she teaches Matilda's peers, who are learning much more basic, well, age appropriate subjects and things that Matilda is already so fluent in. So what we have is Miss Honey is very much playing a part in Matilda's life that Miss Phelps had initially. She is someone that she can trust, Matilda can trust, and so we see this beautiful evolution of another adult deciding to take a positive role in Matilda's life in terms of her development. And it's evident that Miss Honey sees education and intellectual growth much like Miss Phelps, in that let's try and encourage her in every way possible. And this is a much more, it's a more active stance, as we will see later in the chapter, than Miss Phelps. But nonetheless, it is that different attitude when you compare these women to the Wormwoods and Miss Trunchbull. We also see Matilda's attitude as perceived by Miss Honey, that she's very humble, and in fact, it says she hardly seems aware of it. She's very polite, as we said in the early chapter in the Limerick. She shows signs of great respect towards her teacher, and Matilda, in fact, soaks up the attention and help that she's given to her. Once again, after the library, this is the first time that her intelligence is being recognized by an adult. Beyond giving Matilda these books and offering her tutelage in class, Miss Honey is so excited by Matilda that she wants to go and reach out to the parents, which is a step further than Miss Phelps had done. I'm going to refer to the book over here. Miss Honey, meanwhile, was making another decision. She was deciding that she would go herself and have a secret talk with Matilda's mother and father as soon as possible. She simply refused to let the matter rest where it was. The whole thing was ridiculous. She couldn't believe that the parents were totally unaware of their daughter's remarkable talents. After all, Mr. Wormwood was a successful motor car dealer, so she presumed that he was a fairly intelligent man himself. In any event, parents never underestimated the abilities of their own children. Quite the reverse. Sometimes it was well nigh impossible for a teacher to convince the proud father or mother that their beloved offspring was a complete nitwit. Miss Honey felt confident that she would have no difficulty in convincing Mr. and Mrs. Wormwood that Matilda was something very special indeed. The trouble was going to be to stop them from getting over-enthusiastic. This passage goes back to the very beginning, where Miss Honey, just as the narrator was describing, expects that all parents overestimate, not underestimate, their children. And she's expecting Mr. and Mrs. Wormwood to be over enthusiastic. She's actually quite worried about how she's going to hold them back. And her true dedication, the next sentence over here after this passage is shown, because she's like, maybe I'll even be able to give Matilda private lessons if they agree to it. As the chapter continues, Miss Honey, with this expectation, walks from her house to the Wormwoods, and she is once again one of the adults who is making an extreme effort to have a positive impact on the children, and specifically in this instance, Matilda, the child in her care. Now you also see the consideration that she has towards Matilda. She wants to go and avoid, putting her in an embarrassing situation by going there when Matilda will be sleeping. So she goes there quite late, and she goes out of her way in order to be supportive of her. And there's a description of the nice house that the Wormwood lives in, and you get the idea that, well, he must be successful. This is a good thing. And obviously we already know that from the inside, things aren't all as they seem. Mr. Wormwood is introduced to us, and he is described as ratty by the narrator. So this contrast with all this idea that he has of himself, of being handsome and so on. And also he immediately assumes that Matilda's done something wrong when Miss Honey introduces herself and says she's come to speak about her. And again, this is a complete undermining and lack of support that Matilda has from her family, from her parents, which in other circumstances should not, according to the narrator, be like that. Let's go to the book and read this passage. Got into trouble already, has she? Mr. Wormwood said, blocking the doorway. Well, she's your responsibility from now on. You'll have to deal with her. She's in no trouble at all, Miss Honey said. I have come with good news about her, quite startling news, Mr. Wormwood. Do you think I might come in for a few minutes and talk to you about Matilda? We're right in the middle of watching one of our favorite programs, Mr. Wormwood said. This is most inconvenient. Why don't you come back some other time? Miss Honey began to lose patience. Mr. Wormwood, she said, if you think some rotten TV program is more important than your daughter's future, then you ought not to be a parent. Why don't you switch the darn thing off and listen to me? Mr. Wormwood's reaction is a complete contrast to Miss Honey, who previously said she simply refused to let the matter rest where it was. She sees Matilda's future and the opportunities that Matilda could have as of utmost importance. It is a matter of urgency. She must hurry in order to move things as quickly as possible for this girl, whereas Mr. Wormwood basically tries to block Miss Honey from coming in, and this is all due to a TV program which they're watching. This is obviously very clear, more disregard towards poor Matilda, and at the same time, Mr. Wormwood also is very, very, very willing to relinquish, to give up his responsibility of Matilda, where he thinks that she's in trouble, and he tells Miss Honey, well, she's your responsibility now, which is similar to the attitude of Miss Trunchbull, where Miss Honey was trying to improve Matilda's situation, and Miss Trunchbull said, well, she's your responsibility. I know you're trying to get out of it. They don't seem to understand that people could have the Matilda's best interest at heart. There's also, of course, Miss Honey through all of this must be devastated and shocked, given her expectations of how parents should be extremely doting on their children, and doesn't understand how they could not care. Again, she's so devoted to the cause of Matilda's education and the opportunities that, and how important those opportunities would be for Matilda, that she's willing to be quite brutal, quite strong, in comparison to how she's initially described as being gentle and so on, in order to get the parents to listen to her. There's finally, in this chapter throughout, there is the central role. The television is very much central to the scene, and we will see how it is used in order as a symbol of intellectualism versus the opposite of it, where you have the Wormwoods vying and cheering everything that has to do with television, whereas on the opposite side we have Miss Honey, Matilda, and basically anyone who is interested in furthering their education as seen as morally superior to anyone who is more invested in watching the television. As we said, Miss Honey pushes herself in, given that Mr. Wormwood is not terribly hospitable towards her, isn't very welcoming, and she goes in. She isn't offered a seat. They're extremely rude and very unhappy that she is in their TV program, their favorite TV program time. Mrs. Wormwood also is absolutely upset and barely wants to switch off the sound. She's reassured that she can watch it with the sound on, but then essentially she's drawn into the conversation against all her will. The way that the TV in the text is described is consistently negative, which reinforces this idea that it is morally inferior to book reading, etc. So it's described, it's said by Miss Honey, who says, "Switch that darn thing off," and Mrs. Wormwood is gazing rapturously at the TV screen, rapturously being completely overwhelmed. Miss Honey continues to try and engage the parents in terms of how clever, how intelligent and brilliant Matilda is, in terms of her reading and so on. But the Wormwoods just don't seem to get it at all. And let's go back to the book and look at this passage. "But does it not intrigue you," Miss Honey said, "that a little 5-year-old child is reading long adult novels by Dickens and Hemingway? Doesn't that make you jump up and down with excitement?" "Not particularly," the mother said. "I'm not in favor of blue-stocking girls. A girl should think about making herself look attractive so she can get a good husband later on. Looks is more important than books, Miss Hunky." "The name is Miss Honey," Miss Honey said. "Now, look at me," Mrs. Wormwood said. "Then look at you. You chose books. I chose looks." Miss Honey looked at the plain, plump person with the smug suet pudding face who was sitting across the room. "What did you say?" she asked. "I said you chose books and I chose looks," Mrs. Wormwood said. "And who's finished up the better off? Me, of course. I'm sitting pretty in a nice house with a successful businessman, and you're left slaving away teaching a lot of nasty little children the ABC. "Quite right, Sugar Plum," Mr. Wormwood said, casting a look of simpering sloppiness at his wife. It would have made a cat sick. So let's go to the vocabulary. The sugar plum and simpering sloppiness is, in Mr. Wormwood's last phrase, quite right. Sugar plum. He said, casting a look of such simpering sloppiness at his wife. So it's very gushy, it's very emotional and sickly. Simpering sloppiness is sickly sweet. It's not even complimentary. The narrator isn't saying that he's saying it in a nice way. It's actually makes you feel nauseous the way that he's done it. And this is Mr. Wormwood trying to, absolutely supporting the idea of that his wife has, that looks are more important than books. The term sugar plum is a term of endearment. It's like calling someone darling, sweetheart, honey bunny, and all those sorts of things. The narrator means to show up Mr. Wormwood as idiotic in his agreement with his wife's comment. He does read, but it has to be with a purpose. He reads car magazines because it contributes to his ability to make money. It is essential to his work. So he doesn't really understand why Matilda would read for pleasure, and also he just considers it as a complete waste of time. Like him, Mrs. Wormwood is very clear and is central to the ideas that the author is trying to bring to the fore about women and financial security and ethics, in terms of the fact that she's very straightforward about the fact that you should not, there's no point in women carry on in their education. They need to focus on their exterior beauty, and that will allow them to sit back and relax and get a husband to look after them. Of course, she doesn't understand any of the value that teaching nasty little children, she also clearly doesn't like children very much, what Miss Honey or any educator would get out of that, and the satisfaction of being able to grow individuals. And in conclusion, we see all the time that the narrator is trying to say Mrs. Honey is doing the right thing versus the Wormwoods, who are ignorant, who worship the television, and who will not read and do not treasure books, are morally inferior. Miss Honey now tries to engage the parents away from books, and to the point that Matilda is a mathematical genius. Their reaction remains the same. They just do not understand the point of it. Just as Matilda thought that she may as well do these sums in her head, and that calculators, if a calculator could do it, she could too. Her parents think the complete opposite, where they go, why would you want to do that if there's a calculator? Miss Wormwood now brings in the television and the TV, their favorite TV program, to illuminate Miss Honey about her philosophy, about being brainy. Let's go to the book. A girl doesn't get a man by being brainy, Miss Wormwood said. Look at that film star, for instance, she added, pointing at the silent TV screen, where a bosomy female was being embraced by a craggy actor in the moonlight. You don't think she got him to do that by multiplying figures at him, do you? Not likely. And now he's going to marry her. You see if he doesn't. And she's going to live in a mansion with a butler and lots of maids. Mrs. Wormwood's use of the actress and the scenario in the TV program to try and make her point about books versus looks is completely flawed. It is wrong, of course, because we know that the show is scripted. The show is fake. The show does not in any way reflect reality. But the fact that Mrs. Wormwood doesn't even get that is humorous, but also shows how foolish she is and her logic. Of course, there is the fact that the actress is beautiful, no doubt, but she's also working, she's acting for money, and beauty may have gotten her that role, but of course there's also application, and this is what makes Mrs. Wormwood's notion of being able to just look good and then rely on someone to support her very, very wrong. And at least from the narrator's perspective, that is not the correct way to go about things in comparison to, for instance, a hardworking Miss Honey. The chapter continues. Miss Honey remains completely baffled, shocked, and unable to understand their rationale, and tries to make the argument that university is something that Matilda could be reaching for in a few years with the proper preparation, and the Wormwoods think it is absolute nonsense and absolutely useless. Miss Honey finally manages to conclude that university and education and Matilda's ability to find opportunities in that and all professionals that come out of university have a very important role in society and cannot be done without. So university also leads to financial gain, and still this doesn't really resound with the Wormwoods, and the chapter ends in this way.